Good morning, or afternoon, I guess. I kind of took a long time getting to the recording of this particular video. The purpose of this explanation/teaching is to offer a little bit of background in advance of the sermon for this coming Sunday. We're going to be doing a quick overview of the last few stories from the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be looking at what the structure and what the various accounts, like the bits and pieces that are worked into the structure, like how they teach us a larger message than what's obvious in the series as standalones. It's sort of an overarching theme to all of these different accounts. One bit of background that I wanted to cover that I didn't think I was going to have time to do in depth, but I did want to talk about for a few minutes and provide opportunity for folks to understand, is the whole Son of Man label. Over and over again in the gospel accounts, we see where Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. It is kind of his preferred title in a lot of ways. And I honestly, when I was first reading the Bible, it just struck me as odd. I never understood what it meant. And I thought it might be worthwhile to toss it out there and explain exactly what is going on with this particular title. So there's a lot of discussion around it, some theories, some incorrect arguments, I would argue, suggest. There's a main idea that's pretty widely accepted, and we'll get to that. But understand, there have been whole books written on this. A lot of it's just academia. It's not that brilliant. It's not that groundbreaking. It's just sort of this weird academic exploration. And so understand, the next few things I'm going to talk about, they do offer a little context, but I'm going to kind of explain why they're not that exciting and not that important as we go. But it's good to know. So first off, popular theories that haven't panned out. The first is that the Son of Man refers to just being human. And actually, we do see the phrase used in the Old Testament in that way repeatedly, where the Son of Man is used to refer to just men. And it sort of follows, right? The Son of a Man would also be a man. And so it could, in some settings, refer to just a human being. Of course, in terms of the context for Christ's usage, it falls apart really quickly because it's just not the case. You look at a lot of the times when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, he's not really doing it in a way that implies that he's just a man. It's associated with these grand, prophetic statements or these things that he was sent to accomplish or what have you. And so, it's not a really great argument to say that it's just human being, but it is used that way sometimes in the Old Testament, and that's worth noting. It does pick up additional meaning. Sometimes in the rabbinic literature, we come across it being used as a reference to all human beings, especially me. And so if a person said the Son of Man, he's saying all men, especially me. And so, it's not used that way in the New Testament, but the type of phrase or the type of usage would be sort of akin to when Paul says that all people are sinners and I am the worst. And he's saying all humans, especially me. And so, that's a spot where we, a usage that we see in the rabbinic literature when the rabbis would talk, they would use this phrase to refer to themselves and with an emphasis as me doubly so. But largely as me as an example of all human beings. Finally, there's this self-referential thing. And so you'd see where rabbis would use this phrase and they would say the Son of Man, and they're talking about themselves. And it is the case, and you see Jesus use it a lot in that manner. Jesus is often self-referencing by saying the Son of Man. However, it's the case that all humans, especially me, and this self-referential one, there's just no instances of it being a first century Aramaic phrase. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you have this huge chunk of the golly, I'm losing my mind, of the rabbinical writing, like when the rabbis, like the Talmud and all that, it's all Hebrew, right? Like it is the language of the Jewish people, the language of the Jewish scriptures, like it is Hebrew. And so like when you see it used in that setting in the Old Testament as well, it's a Hebrew phrase. When you jump into the New Testament, like the New Testament writers, they didn't really speak Hebrew for the most part. I mean, some of them did, and you see them use Hebrew phrases, but for the most part, they're speaking Aramaic, which is a completely different language. And Aramaic is the language that a lot of this was set in. Occasionally, you see where they'll quote the Greek scriptures. So, like a lot of times when you see the disciples quoting the Old Testament, they're quoting the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible. But a lot of them just didn't know Hebrew, or they didn't quote Hebrew very often. They didn't speak it freely. Like this is a culture that spoke Aramaic primarily, and they spoke Greek because everybody spoke Greek, and everybody read Greek because it was the language of, it was like the international language, and like it was all commerce was done in Greek. The New Testament was pretty much written in Greek, and so like that is the case. Like Greek is just the language that this is all going on in. And that all humans, especially me, like from the rabbinic literature, this is a Hebrew phrasing. It's not really something you see Aramaic speakers use. It's just not. So when Jesus says the Son of Man, he's probably not using it in these ways because it would be outside of the language that they're speaking. Like it's just not the way people talked. It was not a phrase that was used. It was not, the rabbinic speaking was not the same as regular Hebrew talk. And so that's kind of the biggest weaknesses there. But also, like in terms of it being self-referential, like when a rabbi would say referring to himself the Son of Man, like that is the case. Jesus does that. Like he calls himself the Son of Man. And so in that sense, it is self-referencing, but it is not self-referencing exclusively. It also has an added weight. And what that added weight is, and it's pretty universally accepted, like it is this universally accepted idea that what Jesus is doing is he is quoting a particular verse from Daniel. And we're going to get into that. But like to explain here, the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament, obviously. It was very popular in the first century. Actually, I have some slides dealing with this. Let me work through my slides so I'm following my outline. The phrase itself, like people just didn't use it in vernacular. It was not a popularly used word amongst any group until after Jesus like sort of coined it and owned it. And then you start seeing it turn up in different places, but like really Jesus kind of owns it, right? Like this Son of Man thing is something that he has turned into common use phrasing. And he's probably drawing it from Daniel 7. Josephus, the Jewish historian, he tells us that first century Jews were all about the book of Daniel. And it's not surprising. The book of Daniel is the story of the prophet Daniel and his time in exile. The Jews, toward the end of their, like the Old Testament, you see where they're taken away into exile, captured by the Babylonian nation, and the people are taken away as slaves to live in Babylon. And it's sort of the exile. It is their time where they are no longer a nation in Israel. And they had to kind of come to grips as to what it meant to live in a foreign land with like pagans who were trying to force them to worship different like gods that were not the God, how to maintain their uniqueness and their culture and their language and their religion in this foreign land. All of this other stuff plays into it, and it sort of parallels what like the Jews are experiencing in first century. Not exactly because they are in Israel, but they've been conquered by Rome, and so they're under Roman oppression, and like the world was very Hellenized. What that means is like the Greek culture had taken over everything. There were Hellenist schools that people were like kids would go to. That's part of what made synagogue so popular, was nobody wanted to send their kids to the Hellenist schools, so they like opened their own schools, like their own Hebrew schools, and they'd send their kids to those instead of to the Hellenist schools. And so like there's sort of this sense amongst the first century Jews that they are under oppression from Rome, and it sort of parallels what's being experienced by the Jews in exile in Babylon. And so they're looking for a deliverer, they're looking for a Messiah, they're looking for all these things, and they're looking back to these previous experiences and saying, well, what can we learn from this? So it's a very popular read, and there's a lot of apocalyptic stuff, a lot of end of the world, a lot of the God comes and, saves his people and all that. And that's another reason it was very popular, because they're looking for a guy to come along and deliver them. That's part of at the time Jesus came along, the messianic expectation is what it's called. It's this huge cultural expectation that God would send a deliverer. And so people are looking for that Messiah. And like a lot of times you see where folks ask, hey, are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? And like they argue about whether or not he's the Messiah. And so like Jesus brings it into popular vernacular. This Son of Man is specifically in Daniel 7. And it's there in a big, huge, like impactful way, and like the whole book is popular for Jews, but first century Jews in Israel would have known this phrase, and like they would have known it maybe in a couple of different ways, but like he's making a claim toward like significant God-like status. Whenever he says the Son of Man, it's not like, one time Christ refers to himself as the I Am, which is the Jews took to be horribly blasphemous because he took God's name on himself. He calls himself the Son of God. He says, my Father. He forgives sins. And they're like, well, who can forgive sins except God? And he's like, well, me, because I am God, but he never says that stuff outright. And the Son of Man is sort of like an in-between phrase that's a little easier to get away with. It's a little less obvious, but people did know what it meant. They knew Daniel 7. And so what happens is, in Daniel 7, God, who's referred to him as the Ancient of Days, gives the Son of Man like a kingdom that will last forever, and dominion and honor and all of this other stuff. And he's greatly rewarded by the Ancient of Days, who is God. And so like when Jesus refers to himself, he's referring to himself as like the Son of Man. It's referring to himself as this sort of figure from this end of the world story, this vision. And he's saying, listen, I am the one who will receive this. I am the one who will be given honor. I'm the one who will be given a kingdom. I'm the one who will be like shown in this way. And people probably would have gotten that. Now, I'm going to explain real quick what's going on in this particular text, Daniel 7. The first chapters 2 through 7 are all about God's people facing persecution and pressure, right? Like the story of Daniel refusing to eat meat from the king's table. And the idea there is he wouldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols. He wouldn't dishonor God by eating unclean food. And so he doesn't eat meat. And God honors him for it because he refuses to be pushed into what he sees as immoral behavior. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, like Rakshak and Benny for most of us who read the Message Bible. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are forced to bow down to a statue, a golden statue. And like they say, no, we're just not going to do that. Like, we're not going to do it. You can kill us, but we won't do it. And say, Nebuchadnezzar tries to execute them, and it doesn't work out because God delivers them, and there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. But over and over again in these chapters, we see where God's people are put in a position where they're being forced and persecuted and pressured into idolatry, into pagan worship, and God delivers them over and over again. So we pick up in chapter 7, and Daniel has this dream, and he dreams about the nation of Israel in the promised land, and like these beasts come up out of the Mediterranean Sea, like 4 of them come up out of the Mediterranean Sea, and they attack Israel, and they attack it and attack it and attack it. The 4th one is a beast with 10 horns, and one of those horns is a little horn, and that little horn spawns out of the 4th beast, and it becomes its own beast, and like it in turn persecutes the saints. And like in the midst of all of this persecution of the saints, God comes down and like the Ancient of Days comes down, is seated on his throne, and sits in judgment over these beasts. Now, we're not going to get into all of that. Like, there's a whole lot going on there. It is a lot of prophetic stuff. It is a lot of pointing forward stuff. It could refer to an awful lot of things. I'm not going to like have this whole sidetrack onto this topic because like there are a lot of different interpretations, and I think you can lose the point here, okay? And here's the point. When Jesus is talking about himself as the Ancient of Days. You see where like the saints are being persecuted. So there's this suffering amongst the righteous people who are close to God, who are following God, who belong to God. Like God's people are suffering. They're being tormented. They're being oppressed. They're being mistreated. And then the Ancient of Days brings in the Son of Man. He comes down in the clouds, and like he's given this never-ending like kingdom and dominion and authority and all this other stuff, and all the while they're sitting in judgment over these beasts that are attacking Israel. Now, what on earth do we do with all of that? Well, here's the thing. The Son of Man is this exalted figure, but the story itself isn't just about exaltation. It's also got an awful lot of suffering to it. So when you refer to the Son of Man, over and over and over again, it brings with it the connotation, the weight of a story about suffering and about exaltation before God and a kingdom that will last forever. There really aren't all that many phrases or words or titles apart from like the suffering servant in Isaiah, and that would be a weird thing to call himself. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as the Son of Man, and really doesn't carry the same like implication. It doesn't bring all of that baggage with it. And so what we see is when Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, he's referring to himself in a way that carries with it a lot of this additional weight, a lot of these additional ideas, and that's going to be important for this week's sermon, is that the Son of Man is a title associated with suffering and persecution at the hands of wicked men, and then the other half of it is exaltation and an everlasting kingdom before God. And so, understand, when we get into this week's sermon, Christ refers to himself as the Son of Man 2 times in this chapter, and they are parts of that poetic form. If you watch the video from last week, from yesterday, I talked about this poetic form, and 2 of the points are this Son of Man revelation, where he says, the Son of Man, or he refers to himself as the Son of Man. And so he's referring to himself in this way, and it's because he's saying, guys, I'm God. He's doing God's stuff, and he's calling himself the Son of Man. And here's the text from Daniel 7. I'll read it to you so you know what it is. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the cloud of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away. In his kingdom, one that shall not be destroyed. And so this is this everlasting kingdom. Now, there's a lot going on in that text. For starters, it ends with this: his kingdom will not be destroyed. The Jews are waiting for a king to come to be over them again, but he's going to be in David's lineage. And so David, this Davidic king, is supposed to come, and God has promised that his descendant, David's descendant, would be on the throne in Israel forever. And that's a reference to Christ. And Daniel here is doubling down on it. He's saying, listen, that promise God made to David, it still counts, and it's still coming, and that's Jesus. And so Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. He's saying, I'm that Davidic king. I'm in the line of David. I am the king that will be on the throne forever. My kingdom will never be destroyed. And so, that's the idea here. I'll point out one like the Son of Man who came down from the clouds in the heavens. This sort of tips the hand of the God-man, fully God, fully man sort of dynamic that we see in the Gospels, that we see in the New Testament. It's pretty much Orthodox Christianity. We all believe it. It points to this truth that he is both God and he is man. He is in the form of man. And so what we're seeing here is when Christ refers to himself in this way, he is importing all of this stuff along with the suffering aspect, along with this glorification aspect, and it's not a small deal, especially since all of the Gospels are pointing in the direction of Christ going to Jerusalem, being arrested, being persecuted, being falsely tried, being crucified, dead, and resurrected on the 3rd day. And so that suffering will then turn into resurrection. And in fact, actually, the Gospel of John, the whole Gospel of John is all about how Christ's suffering is his glory, and how his suffering, doing God's will and saving his people, is the glory that Christ experiences. It is his glorification. So why use like this more obscure phrase? Well, for starters, Messiah is a very politically loaded title. There are a lot of guys who were like would-be messiahs. There's one on every street corner. I think John said that to me recently. There's a messiah on every street corner, and everybody is waiting for this messiah to come and lead a rebellion and fight the bad guys and beat up the Romans and free them from captivity and all this other stuff. And so everybody's waiting for this messiah. Second, like if he called himself the son of David, which is something that he sometimes gets referred to as, like, but the son of David is another like very politically loaded title. And people are really antsy about that because every time there's an uprising, every time there's a political upheaval or a pushback, the Romans kill a lot of people. There's one point in time before, like during Christ's young years, I guess it would have been, there's a rebellion where the Romans lined the streets of Rome from Jerusalem to Rome itself, lined the streets from Jerusalem to Rome with crucified Pharisees who had rebelled. I mean, these guys are not... They're not playing around, but the Jews want to be free. And so every time they get beat up for trying to rebel, they just come back and do it again. And so, like, a lot of the messiahs are, like, political uprisings, and they are, like, political usurpers, or people coming along and saying, I'm the one God sent to free my people, and then they all get killed. And so, like, part of the reason he's not calling himself that is, like, he's not trying to become crowned king right then. He's not trying to lead an earthly rebellion. And in fact, when Peter tries to do that, when he takes out a sword and tries to save Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's like, hey, I didn't come here for this. I'm not here to fight a rebellion and to die in battle. Like, knock it off. Finally, the Son of Man, as it's used in Daniel, it carries these connotations. And what we're going to see in the Mark text is that, like, Christ reveals himself, I am God. And the more like God he is, the more he puts his stuff out there, the more he performs miracles, the more he does things that only God can do, the more resistance, the more fight back, the more pushback he gets from the Pharisees, until finally they start planning to kill him. And, like, with all of that pushback, that suffering is coming. And right in the middle of the chiasm, the poem that we talked about in the last video yesterday, right in the middle of that, he talks about the bridegroom. And he says the bridegroom will be taken away and then you'll fast. And it's a pointing forward to, like, hey guys, I'm going to die. And so he calls himself the Son of Man, and that's connected to this idea that, like, the crucifixion is coming, but he will also be glorified, and something new will come about as a resultant of him being there. And so that exaltation and suffering aspect associated with the Daniel 7 prophecy, Jesus is intentionally bringing that into the conversation. He wants people to hear that. He wants them to understand it, and they still don't get it. Until after the resurrection, when Jesus is, days away from the cross, and he says that he's going to be turned over and crucified, and Peter says, "Oh no, that can't happen to you," and that's not even possible. And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," because he's ready for this to take place. So, what does this have to do with our sermon on Sunday? Well, again, we're going to be going through these events from chapters 2 and 3, and it's structured in a way that tells us big things. What are the big things it's going to tell us? Well, it's going to tell us that Christ came, that he was God. The more he revealed himself as God, the more resistance he encountered, but also that he is the bridegroom who will leave the party. And then people will mourn, then people will fast, then people will like rend their clothes and everything else, and not until then. And so he's pointing forward to that in this particular collection of texts, and the Son of Man is two of the points in the poem, like two of the chiastic points, and it's on either side of this, like, hey, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be executed, the new thing will be broken by the old thing, and the old thing will be broken by the new thing, but Christ will be forever. So Jesus reveals himself to be God in bits and pieces, and this is a part of it. And like him calling himself the Son of Man is just inflaming more resistance. It's making them more and more and more frustrated. There are other ways that he does that in the text. He forgives sins. He teaches as one with authority, which is like a huge thing we're not going to talk about today. But like the big idea here as we go into this Sunday sermon, understanding, number one, the poetic form from the previous video, and then this time understanding this Son of Man idea, that all of these first century Jews have read this Daniel book 1,000,000 times, and they're all waiting for it. They're all sitting on the edge of their seat waiting for the Son of Man to show up and to kick the monsters that are coming out of the Mediterranean Sea back into the sea. sea. And so like they hear this and they're saying, well, wait a minute, what's he saying now? What's going on here? Because had he said Messiah, there would be no in between. They would misunderstand it, but like they would know he was saying he was God's chosen one to lead his people. You know, had he said the Son of David, they would know he was claiming to be the King of the Jews. But he didn't do those things. Instead, he said Son of Man, to suffer and to be exalted. And so that's all going to work into this Sunday sermon. Really looking forward to it. If you've got questions about this, if you want to know more, if you thought these were useful and would like me to keep doing them, let me know. I will keep doing them. I'm going to do them for as every time something comes up I think is valuable to teach on. I kind of enjoy doing this. And so, but let me know if you watched it. Let me know if you got something out of it. Share it if you think it's worth like watching. But that is it. That is why Jesus called himself the Son of Man. He was referring to God's like promised deliverer, to the man who would be the new king and who would face down the beast from the sea. So I will see you guys Sunday. Hopefully this helps with the message. God bless. Again, share, comment, let me know. If you made it this far, thanks for listening.